Boston. I'm talking today with BUR reporter Todd Wallack about a special report that MassLive published by BUR on the state of public housing in Massachusetts. We'll be taking your questions this afternoon and comments, so please feel free to dive in and join our conversation. We'll ask as many of your questions as we possibly can. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. So last week, MassLive published a story that BUR did with ProPublica looking at the state of public housing in Massachusetts. You guys discovered that even though there are thousands of people on a waiting list, thousands of units still sit empty. The nickel tour of the story and what you and your team discovered.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure your audience knows how tight housing is in Massachusetts. We're one of the most expensive states in the country, and homelessness has been rising. There are record numbers of people in shelters. Governor declared a state of emergency recently because there's so many people in shelters, and they have to put people in hotel rooms. And there are 184,000 people on the wait list for state public housing. Despite all that, we found out that nearly 2,300 state public housing units are empty and not occupied, and it surprised me, and it surprised a lot of other people.
I mean, this is obviously the product of a lot of work. The story is about 2,800 words or thereabouts. Talk to me about the genesis of the reporting on this. From sort of, I'm always fascinated by when you get the germination of an idea and then you see it across to the finish line. I mean, at what point did you start to think this is something we need to look at? Where did that come from?
Sure. It started just by realizing that one of the topics our listeners and readers are really interested in is housing. I mean, so many people have tales of trying to buy a house, trying to rent an apartment, and really struggling. It's just so expensive in Massachusetts, and there's so many people who can't find any place at all. So I was looking for stories related to housing. And one issue that I know has happened in a couple other cities around the country is concerns that not all the housing units there are being used. So I was really curious here, and I saw some scattered complaints, but I'd never seen any story about the number statewide or the problems statewide. So I filed a public records request, like a lot of journalists do, and got the data, and it was a big number. And at that point I realized there's a story. I still had a lot of questions. I had to find out whether the numbers were accurate in the data I was getting, and then find out why, and find out greater context of what it meant.
The story leads with a woman named Deborah Libby from Worcester, who moved into subsidized housing there, a remodeled garage, I think, if memory serves. She's
A converted garage.
Converted garage, yeah, contending with pancreatic cancer as well. She becomes sort of the prism through which you view this story. I mean, tell me about her. What was she like? How do you make her sort of the focus here?
Yeah, so the story, it's an interesting thing. The story is about apartments and empty apartments, and why they're empty. But the reason why we care is because it affects real people. And again, there are 184,000 people on the wait list for these subsidized apartments. And so in the course of reporting, I talked to a bunch of people, including Deb Libby, who are on the wait list, and they didn't know anything about the empty units. They were baffled to hear about it. But I wanted to let readers and listeners hear from one of the people who is stuck on the wait list while there are all these apartments that they could use that are going wasted. And Deb Libby is somebody who could be any of us. She doesn't earn a ton of money. She earns a little over minimum wage working in a hardware store. And she had bad luck and got cancer, which has recently come back. And because of health problems, she can't work that many hours. And so that limits her options. And then her building sold, and the new owner wanted her out. And she's due to be evicted by the end of the month. So she has a very limited amount of time. When the eviction proceeding started, she was lucky enough to get a a free lawyer through a nonprofit who helped her and signed her up for the state wait list. That was last October. She's still waiting. She hasn't heard anything from any of the housing agencies about where she is on the wait list or when she'll be able to get an apartment.
When was the last time you spoke with her?
I spoke to her last week.
How's she doing?
She was really worried. She said she needs a place to live. She's really desperate. Since my story ran, at least one housing agency has reached out to her with some advice on where else she could apply, but I don't know where she'll go, and she didn't either the last time I talked to her.
So, I mean, who ultimately bears responsibility here? I mean, where does the buck always stops someplace? I mean, with whom does it stop in this instance?
Well, like a lot of stories, it's complicated and nuanced. There's more than one person to point the finger at, because there are lots of reasons. So one of the biggest reasons is that the state is now using a new system to manage this wait list. It's a statewide wait list that they started 4 years ago. Started with good intentions. The legislature mandated it because they didn't want people to have to go to each individual housing agency. They wanted to make it more convenient for people. There are also questions about whether some housing agencies were going out of order and giving people special preference. So they wanted to make sure it was fair, but the new system has not worked well at all. There have been all sorts of problems. A lot of the information in the system is inaccurate. There's no checking at the front end, so housing agencies are checking at the back end and often finding out people don't qualify or they don't qualify for priority and need to be moved down the list, all while apartments are sitting vacant. Also, because people can now sign up statewide through one system, housing agencies across the state are all drawing names from the same system, which means they wind up screening people at the same time, all competing with each other, duplicating efforts, drawing out the process. And a lot of people are really, really frustrated working for local housing agencies with the state system. So that's one problem, but there are other problems. A lot of housing agencies say they don't have enough staff to pick people. They also don't have enough staff and money to maintain apartments. In some cases, those are big renovations that have piled up over time. The state itself estimates there's over $3 billion backlog in repairs that need to be made. Some advocates think it's more than double that. Some units are in such bad shape they've been condemned. There are other units that just need some paint and cleaning and minor stuff, but many agencies say they're so short-staffed and so busy dealing with the apartments in really awful condition that they don't even have the time to quickly turn around those units that are in pretty good condition. So that's another issue, and a lot of people point their fingers at the legislature and say the legislature hasn't allocated enough funding. Then there's other issues, like in some cases, local housing agencies have decided to leave units vacant deliberately for one reason or another. Sometimes they're planning huge major renovation projects, and they decide we're going to stop filling vacancies until we finish that renovation. But the renovation can often take years to even start. So I found a case in Somerville where units were sitting for as long as 6.5 years before construction began. So that's one issue. And another issue is we found more than 120 apartments that local housing agencies have repurposed for other things they want to use. And it could be laundry rooms, it could be office space, it could be storage. One in Salem's using a unit for file storage and an employee break room. Somerville's even using 1 2-bedroom apartment for its own police station and space for that. So there are a variety of reasons that all mean that lots of units are unavailable to people who desperately need housing. So you could point the finger in lots of different ways, and a lot of people are responsible.
So when you talk to state lawmakers about this, this is all coming against this backdrop of the migrant housing crisis as well. Governor Healy facing all of this pressure to deal with that issue, kind of pointing the finger at Washington, saying it's their fault for not doing something about a bad system? And what are lawmakers telling you about where this is and where this stands?
Well, you were there when I asked Speaker of the House, Ron Mariano, about it. He said he's glad that after I talked to the state said that they are aware of the problems with the wait list and are trying to fix it. He seems skeptical about the claims that local housing agencies need more money. He said, I'm sure it's true in some cases. I'm not sure it's true in others. And it's like any other need by a city or town. So it sounds really up in the air of whether the legislature is willing to provide more money to solve at least a piece of this problem.
And your team reported just Monday, I guess, that there's this 90-day push to try to fill these vacancies. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so after we published this story, the state on late Friday afternoon issued a memorandum saying they're going to make a 90-day push to fill as many vacant units as they can by the end of the year, offering both money and other assistance to local housing agencies across the state. And there are 230 housing agencies across the state that manage this body of state public housing to try to help them. And in some cases that could be money for repairs, in some cases it could be help with finding tenants. But it will be really interesting, and we'll be watching to see, okay, how many units do they actually fill by the end of the year? And how does this effort go?
So Governor Haley created this new housing secretary position to help address a lot of these issues. You spoke with Ed Augustus, the new housing secretary, about this stuff. I mean, what did you hear from him?
So Ed Augustus made it very clear. He's a new housing secretary. He's been in office for about 4 months, sworn in beginning of June. He made it very clear, this is unacceptable. This is a problem when we're in such desperate need and we have publicly funded housing units that are going unused. And of course, we also had Governor Healy on our air, and she also said public housing is a precious resource and we need to address this problem. They've made it clear it's not the only housing issue. They also want to build more housing, but these are housing units that already exist. So it seems crazy not to use them when there's such big need and they're already here.
Do we have any questions floating in? No, none yet. Massachusetts, I think you guys reported that it's the third most expensive state for private housing in the nation. There are a lot of people, as a recent transplant here, I can speak sort of firsthand to the expense of trying to find a place to live. But I mean, if you are in public housing, you're paying substantially less than market rates.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yet, we still find ourselves where we are here.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the reason why there's such huge demand for these subsidized apartments. In the private market, some people don't make 32% of your income in rent each month. And if you don't have any income at all, the minimum is just $5 a month. So you're not going to find any other place for $5 a month.
And when Governor Haley, when she ran in 2022, one of the things she promised to do was try to find a way to bring down housing costs sort of broadly across the state and to make things more affordable. We're looking perhaps later this week at a vote by the General Assembly on a tax relief package that could provide could provide relief to renters, could provide relief to homeowners. I mean, what are we expecting? Do you know? Because we don't know the broad parameters of that package yet. What we might expect to see out of that?
Yeah, I am not sure. Well, I guess we're hoping to hear more details later today on what the legislature is going to do in that specific package. But there's no doubt there's huge interest in the broader problem of how do they help renters and people afford housing? Because even if you have a decent income in Massachusetts, it is so expensive. The average rent for a 2-bedroom in Massachusetts is $3,000. That's among the highest in the country. And in Boston and certain other cities, it's even higher. It's really hard, particularly for people who have big families and need a large space and a lot of bedrooms to afford housing. So I know that both the governor and lawmakers are interested in all sorts of ways to try to help address that situation, whether it's incentives and rules to help encourage build more housing, or tax relief, or incentives to help people who are struggling to afford rent and their mortgage payment to be able to afford that more easily. My story focused on the public housing system, which, by the way, is unusual. Massachusetts is one of only 4 states in the country that even has state public housing. A lot of people are familiar with public housing, but think of big federal projects around the country. Massachusetts actually has more public housing units run in the state system than the federal, and more state housing than anywhere else in the country. In fact, it has more than twice as many state public units as the other 3 states that have state public housing combined.
Now, you talk a lot of these local housing administrators who are trying to thread the needle as best they can, and the frustration comes across. It's palpable from a lot of these folks. One of them called the system horrible, not once, but twice in one conversation. I mean, what are these folks up against? What kind of needle are they trying to thread here?
Yeah, that was David Hedison of the Chelmsford Housing Authority. I talked to a number of housing directors across the state, and they say, our job is to house people. So many of them are really frustrated having housing that they know could accommodate a family who might be living on the street, might be living in a shelter, might be living in their car, and it is frustrating for them to see those units sit empty or not used.
If your family is looking for help, I mean, where should you go? We have people watching in here. I mean, if they need this kind of help, to whom should they turn?
Right. So we posted some phone numbers and other contact information with our story on WBUR, with contact information for the state shelter system. If people have little income and are homeless, that's one resource. If they want to sign up and need assistance signing up for the state wait list, there's phone number and contact information. There's an online form for CHAMP, which is the name of the web form used to apply for state public housing. But there's lots of other types of affordable housing. It's a really complex web. There's state vouchers, which you can apply for through the state web form. There is federal housing, and there are federal vouchers, which need to be applied generally through local housing agencies that handle that. There's also lots of private developers that have set aside some units as affordable, that often have their own wait lists or their own lotteries to get those units. And we've heard a lot of complaints from people that it's really complicated. If you need help, there's so many different places to look, and it hasn't been centralized. It's not just one place to look.
You obviously talked to a lot of people who are trapped in the system, if they're living on one. Is there another conversation that you had, or an anecdote that really leaps out at you as kind of the archetype of what folks are up against here?
So one issue is I talked to somebody who has been on the wait list for 3 years and has a young daughter. And like a lot of people in unstable housing, she's moved a lot. So at one point she missed some mail from local housing authorities because she hadn't updated her address in the system. One issue that a lot of people have noted is local housing authorities use U.S. mail to contact people. Well, a lot of people in shelters or temporarily living in hotels don't get their mail reliably. So that is one reason why I think some of the units are going unused. They're trying to reach people through mail who don't really get their mail. One housing commissioner referred to it as chasing ghosts. And so that's another part of the problem.
I feel like that's sort of like a whole substrata of the economy or the social strata that goes unaddressed. Those without permanent addresses, the unbanked, people who sort of slip through no fault of their own, who sort of slip through the cracks in the safety net.
Yeah, absolutely. And another issue is the rules for getting housing are complicated. Like we were looking at the rules for who gets priority housing? And you'd think if you're homeless, you get priority housing. But the rules are more specific. The state wants to know, how did you become homeless? So if you became homeless by way of a natural disaster, you rank higher than somebody who became homeless through an eviction. And if you're evicted for not paying your rent, even if you lost your job, you don't get priority housing. So they're very complicated rules, and a lot of people think they deserve priority housing, sign up, and it turns out that they don't. And it takes extra time to sort all that out, and it's, I know, frustrating both for housing agencies that realize they need to reorder the list, and it's frustrating for people who applied in good faith and thought they should get an apartment right away and are instead pushed lower down on the wait list.
And what advocacy groups or issue groups sort of exist to help people navigate these sort of Byzantine rules?
There are housing agencies all across the state that operate shelters, in addition to the state shelter system that try to help people. It's hard because there is such demand and many are full. Many of them have housing coordinators or people who try to help people with housing. I talked to a woman named Doris Romero at the Women's Lunch Place in Boston, who has helped dozens of people apply for state public housing as well as federal housing and vouchers, and been really frustrated with how difficult it is to actually get people housing. But she's tried to help people. There are housing lawyers who've tried to help people sign up. So there are lots of advocates around the state trying to help people navigate the system, but the system is complicated and there's not enough housing at the end of the day available for people. So that is a huge issue.
If there's one takeaway you want your readers, your listeners to come away with from this story, what is it?
I think that the biggest takeaway is we were really surprised to find in a state where there's such a huge need that there are all these apartments that could potentially be used and haven't been. And I think thanks in part to our story, I think the state and local housing officials are trying to find solutions and work on it. There are big questions about whether the legislature will provide more money as another part of the solution. And we want to continue to watch to see what happens after this 90-day push by the state to fill units, how many are actually filled, and how much of the problem remains.
Todd Wallack, thanks very much for the time.
Thank you.
Yeah.